It is the year 164. Eternia is the largest empire the world of Oikia has yet known. Founded by Ricard, it now commands the lives of millions of citizens and the swords of 100 armies. Its power extends to all corners of the civilized world, tolerating no rivals to its dominion. Just over 1 century later, the empire is no more. And yet, it does not go quietly, struggling until the very end. Today, Emperor Julio Enax is remembered as the harbinger of Eternia's golden age, and her greatest ruler. But when his reign began, he was a man of 33, thrust into power after the death of his predecessor and suspected lover, the Emperor Pietron. Under the light of a comet, Julio was crowned before the assembly and the gathered people of the capital city, Lucero. The date had been carefully chosen by astronomers, but to the common man, it seemed like Julio was one chosen by the gods. In honor of Pietron and of this blessing from the gods, Julio ordered the construction of a great temple to the sun god Piernalia, granting the priesthood generous donations. All citizens of the empire were welcome to travel to the capital for a day and night of partying and merriment beneath the tree statues of Piernalia, Pietron, and Julio, whose eternal gaze reminded the people of their great fortune. Soon enough, the diminishing of Luca as head of the Pantheon was of little concern to the people of Eternia. Julio's reign also saw an expansion of the citizenry. Penalties for the worship of foreign gods were greatly reduced, becoming little more than a small tax, while women were for the first time officially recognized as legitimate inheritors of property and titles. Of course, despite being the people's emperor, Julio was still an emperor. Under his reign, the assembly reached its weakest point. Pietron had already abolished the Great Assembly, replacing it with twin advisory and harm assemblies. But Julio reduced them to little more than mouthpieces for his policies. Every single member of each body became handpicked by the emperor himself, able to be dismissed at any time for any reason. Starting in the year 186, Julio began an expansion into the northern deserts, getting the various nomadic and semi-nomadic people of the land to swear fealty or be hunted down. He believed the deserts hid mystic secrets about the god and the universe, and described them as
a majestic place of complete brightness, where it seems each day that the sun must never stop shining.
Unfortunately, as Julio led companies of horsemen on campaign in the desert, the Delphic kingdoms and Durbania, neighboring states to the east and south, had begun to form a coalition to stop the continued expansion and influence of Eternia. One voice in the assembly quickly rose to prominence: Martina. A girl of just 16, appointed when the emperor decreed she would replace her deceased father's seat without having ever met her. She traveled out into the desert to meet the emperor in the winter of 199, and petitioned him to take his armies and launch a preemptive attack against the Delphics and their allies. Persuaded perhaps by her arguments, or perhaps by her sheer tenacity, Julio agreed. And so, in the spring of the year 200, the Delphic War would begin. Julio engaged in a campaign of divide and conquer, first overwhelming the kingdom of Kelvic before striking against Mishalik, and then finally, Durbania. He won not merely with Eternia's own armies, but with bands of Asdarian warriors pledged to him after his campaigns in the north. The desert cavalry proving effective skirmish units against the more static infantry-focused tactics of the east. 3 new provinces were formed from the conquered Delphic kingdoms: Mishalik, Barte, and Mishak, collectively known as Eternia, or the Foreign Land. With ethnically Eternian port cities such as Vitoria along the eastern shore, Eternia now had full control over the northern half of the East Alaxian Sea, and the Durbinian Empire would never again be able to challenge Eternian dominance of the waves. When Emperor Julio Enax suddenly died in the year 246 with no named successor, the assembly moved to elect a man named Barte as ruler. Under Barte, the Great Assembly was reformed as a single body, and for the first time in 90 years, the assembly once again had real political power. Barte would later be remembered as the Forgotten Emperor, due to a comparative lack of records compared to his predecessor and successor. Many have said the man was a mere symptom of increasing instability within Eternia, as central rule was eroded. Indeed, throughout history, some historians have chosen to mark Barte's rule as the end of the Eternian Empire. The truth, as always, is more complicated. Barte's rule saw a weakening of the position of emperor, an end to foreign wars, Eternia's neighbors growing in power, and the provinces granted more autonomy than ever, true. But writing and archaeology from the time indicate that his reign was likely the peak of standard living for the common citizen. Trade was stable, grain was affordable, the arts and sciences well funded. Laws were enforced more laxly, and even the tax for worshipping foreign gods was repealed. Modern historians have taken to re-examining Barte, labeling his reign, and not Julio's, as a true golden age of Eternia. And while his reign was certainly a boon for the common citizen, not everyone was satisfied. Martina became a vocal opponent of Barte's rule, calling on the assembly to treat Eternia's neighbors as constant threats, either enemies of today or enemies of tomorrow. She called for the imperial fist to once more come down upon the enemies of Eternia, both within and without. When Barte died, he hoped to be succeeded by his son, a continuation of his lighter touch. Unfortunately, the assembly had other ideas. Speaking before the Great Assembly following Barte's death in 246, the 62-year-old Martina made her case for the throne.
Barte was a good man, but I not fear a good emperor. He left her enemies free to grow, while the empire began to rot. The citizenry, they forget the place. Those who walk streets of Lucero and those that dwell in the eastern province may as well be living in different lands. Our great lord, the divine Julio, saw fit to appoint me to this body, and I am determined to preserve his legacy, his great work, no matter the cost.
Late in the year, Martina was crowned as Eternia's first and only empress. She began her reign with a brutal crackdown on Eternia, replacing the local-born governors with Eternian-speaking bureaucrats from Lucero, and demolishing local temples. When a coalition of poor citizens, local merchants, and priests rose up in the eastern provinces, Martina used the opportunity to send in the army, crushing the revolt and using the soldiers to build a network of roads. Eternian settlers were offered plots of land from executed rebels, waiting to the Eternian population to mix with the local Devliks. In the place of the ruins of local faiths, Martina ordered the construction of temples to Luca and Piernalia, demanding the conversion of the locals to Eternia's gods. This process of Eternianization would be repeated throughout the other divergent parts of the empire, followed by expansion abroad. Martina oversaw the invasion of the Cantronite kingdom, forcing them to adopt the Eternian gods and tongue and pledge vassalage to the empire. The Corisans to the south were next, already strongly influenced over the early 2 centuries by Vittoria and smaller Eternian parts in the area. Expansion into the region was swift and brutal. Finally, the northern Devnik kingdoms were put to heel, forced to pledge fealty to the emperor, or else be put to the sword. If nothing else, Martina was a woman of her word. It is said that in her entire 34-year reign, only the first was Eternia at peace. But it was not to last. Upon Martina's death, the assembly took power in Eternia. It had already been further strengthening, as in her old age she became increasingly physically incapable of exerting direct rule, when she finally died at the impressive age of 96. For all intents and purposes, Eternia was no more. Gone was the unified state, as Martina, seemingly unable to learn from her many predecessors, also failed to name a successor. Unlike her predecessors, though, the assembly did not appoint a single new emperor to replace her, but rather 2, Minos Luca and Partona Ordokas. Nominally, they were to rule as equals, each a balance to the other to prevent tyranny, but in truth, they were little more than figureheads as a bickering assembly and increasingly autonomous provinces became little more than a loosely unified coalition. For the next 700 years, there was sometimes a single Eternian emperor, and sometimes as many as 5 had been elected to the position. Many provinces governed themselves as effectively independent kingdoms and republics, or fractured even further into baronies and counties. The vassal kingdoms of the east were essentially fully independent, frequently not even paying lip service to the crown and Lucero. Many historians have considered this effectively the dawn of feudalism within the region. Each and every noble, nominally, was pledged in service to the emperor and the Great Assembly, But beyond a small tax or occasionally levy in times of war, the state did not exist. Today, this time is known as the interregnum. Only the most dutiful historians of Eternia could name even 7 emperors in the 7 centuries, let alone all 87. In the late 10th century, the Emperor Pratik, a man born in Eternia, became the first and only Cantronic emperor. He could speak Eternian, worshipped Eternian gods, and yet was still so often looked upon as other by much of the nobility and assembly. Pratik made one final bid to restore the empire, orchestrating a coup in which almost every member of the assembly was executed within a single night. Pratik released a few of the more unruly outlying provinces, namely Barte and Emyx, as sovereign kingdoms, on the condition their new lords agreed to an alliance. While they did pledge to aid Eternia if she was attacked, they proceeded almost immediately to war each other over their own borders and restrictions on trade. For decades, Pratik led the imperial army to crush various minor revolts and uprisings, but by the turn of the millennium, he was an old man, sat upon a throne in Lucero listening as each day more news arrived of unpaid taxes, wars between nobles, crumbling infrastructure, and incursions along the borders. In 1038, the governor Hartoliroa, an experienced commander under Pratik who had helped put down many revolts, marched on Lucero at the head of his own local levies, and a company of Azarian mercenaries. The exact reasons for Liroa's rebellion remain debated to this day, but it is generally agreed he sought to make a grab for power himself. In the ensuing battle, the city burnt. Lucero had long expanded past its ancient walls during the interregnum, and the outskirts fell quickly, put to torch as looters ransacked anything which was not nailed down. The inner city, on a hill protected by its ancient walls, held out longer, but each night the fires of the outskirts could be seen, and each morning smoke lingered in the sky above. One night, according to his advisor, Emperor Pratik is said to have stood at a window in the palace, overlooking the flames of his city, as his council gathered to discuss the defense.
If he was coming, he would have arrived by now. We must assume him dead, or a traitor.
Then we are on our own.
My lord, what shall we do? My lord?
I have failed. It is over.
Pratik retired to his quarters, never to be seen alive again. The next morning, Liroa's army had breached the walls, and his army sacked the inner city. Liroa proclaimed himself emperor, but his coronation was barely attended. One by one, the provinces sent letters, informing the pretender that they would not serve a betrayer. Unable to pay his mercenaries without taxes from his subjects, Liroa was quickly overthrown himself by the mercenary leader Asmere Nahum, forming the kingdom of Lucero. This marked the formal end of Eternia, and the fire which consumed much of the city. The last hope for the empire had been extinguished. Only the greatest stone temples, palaces, and fortifications remained, husks amid empty streets. A last attempt was made in 1042 to restore the long-dead republic, led by a mix of Eternian merchants and nobles. But, unable to gain popular support from the citizenry, they were soundly defeated by Nahum and his supporters, their lands seized, and most forced into exile in the east. While Eternia was no more, its culture, history, and language have continued to leave a mark across East Galaxia for the last 15 centuries. The Eternian script, spread by trade and conquest during and after the Empire, is now the most widely used form of writing in the world. The Empire's eastern provinces eventually reformed into Ahidrera and Caressa, while the Azarian kingdoms in our old heartland grew into Fazara, some of the most influential nations in modern history.